Many still see themselves as underdogs in a culture war, says University of Oklahoma sociologist Samuel Perry.
And they believe that Trump is the guy who has in the past and continues to promise to fight for them.
For now, all eyes are on next week's primary in New Hampshire, a state with fewer evangelicals and more moderate voters who may be somewhat more open to another candidate. Sarah McCammon, NPR News, Manchester, New Hampshire.
The governor of Oregon has declared a state of emergency following a week of deadly winter weather. Oregon Public Broadcasting's Jeff Thompson has the latest.
Since an ice storm moved in a week ago, tens of thousands of people across the state have lost power. More than a dozen people have died due to hypothermia, icy traffic crashes, falling trees, and weather-related fires. 3 people were electrocuted when a falling branch brought a live power line down onto an SUV in Portland. An expected thaw midweek did not pan out, and another ice storm moved in Thursday night. Dozens of school districts in the state have closed for the 4th straight day. Governor Tina Kotek says the statewide emergency means Oregon will get federal help for power system recovery as well as emergency road maintenance. Forecasters say it could be at least 2 or 3 more days before the ice melts. For NPR News, I'm Jeff Thompson in Portland, Oregon.
The Dow Jones Industrial Average is up more than 1%. You're listening to NPR News.
This is KUOW News. I'm Paige Browning. Work to repair damaged rails on Sound Transit's one line is causing delays and overcrowding this week. Writer Salvador Aranda says he's seen delays on his daily trip between Angle Lake and Northgate.
Oh, yeah, definitely a lot. If I miss the one that goes all the way straight, that puts me about a 30-minute behind on my arrival to work. So, yeah.
Some trains run only about every 26 minutes through the downtown stations. On the stations between Westlake and Stadium are closed entirely with shuttle buses between them. The line's not scheduled to return to regular service until February 5th. 8 candidates want to fill a temporary seat on the Seattle City Council, and last night they had a public forum. David Hyde has more.
The candidates were asked a number of questions last night, including one on a vexing issue: how to make the city's most dangerous intersections safer. Vivian Song serves on the Seattle School Board. She says the problem is lack of investment.
We know what the tools are. We can improve lighting in those areas, install speed zone cameras, and have sidewalks.
Steve Strand is the West Precinct commander for Seattle Police. He says the city's goal is to get to 0 fatalities.
We have started with paint as our bicycle lane solution, and it's time that we advance to protective infrastructure.
The council plans to make a decision next Tuesday on who gets the open seat. David Hyde, KUOW News.
We're hearing from the woman who saved a baby in Portland when live wires fell on top of the family SUV during the recent cold snap. Majaya Washington says that she watched a man holding the baby slip and get electrocuted by the live wires. That didn't stop her from trying to reach the baby after she saw the child lift her head.
I'm just thinking that this is something like, you see a baby, who's not going to go save a baby? I just thought I have a nephew myself. I have little brothers. I would want somebody to do the same thing. I would hope somebody would do the same thing.
This happened Wednesday in Portland. Officials say that the baby was taken to a hospital and is expected to be physically okay. This is KUOW.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Indeed, designed to be an end-to-end hiring solution for businesses of all sizes to attract, interview, and hire candidates, all from a single platform. Learn more at Indeed.com/NPR.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. A KUOW listener heard an interview between our All Things Considered host, Kim Malcolm, and the Washington Secretary of State. And that listener thought, I'm a registered voter. I can do that. We'll tell you what that voter did and how that story turned out. Coming up on this program, we are first going to introduce our panel of 3 excellent local journalists. The excelling Seattle Times investigations editor, Jonathan Martin. Welcome back.
Okay.
I mean,
that kind of oversold it.
Excellent people excel. Okay. How about crushing it, freelance health journalist Joanne Silberner?
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here.
What's left, Katherine? Dominating the space. Insider investigations correspondent Katherine Long. Welcome back.
Hey there, glad to be here, especially with that introduction.
Sure, good to have everybody here. And you can watch the show as always. We are live streaming the program on YouTube. Okay, a tough week in a way. I know this isn't Buffalo, but it did get cold enough to kill this week. King County said at least 5 people died of exposure in Seattle. William Macabitas, Mehri Tesfa, and Jay Anderson were all in their 60s. Macabitas was found outside. Anderson found in a vehicle near the Ballard Library. 53-year-old David Tinker died in a residence. 37-year-old Adam Elknation died outside. KUOW spoke with a man named Howard Cartwright in Ballard who is heating his hands over a propane stove on the ground. Cartwright said if his stove were to run out of gas, he might go into a shelter.
It's tough sleeping out here on the concrete. Draws the life from you. In time kills you being out here on it.
And you were saying, Catherine, that Harborview saw a lot of people come in with just complaints and in a tough spot.
That's right. Cold weather related injuries and illnesses. Something that struck me in the coverage of this week's fatally cold weather was that the city's 3 emergency cold weather shelters were all operating at or near capacity, even though they had added beds. I really appreciated KUOW's reporting on this, especially Casey Martin followed a man trying to find emergency shelter in this cold weather. And because of eligibility requirements, there were only 2 that he could try. It's demoralizing a little bit. But one thing I'm interested to hear from Jonathan, because he's covered homelessness at the Seattle Times for so long, is whether you think we're getting any better at handling these types of extreme weather incidents.
Well, they're good at certainly setting up these cold weather shelters, the emergency shelters. The problem with those shelters is that they're congregate shelters with basically mats on a floor, sort of mats in a gym. And they're good at keeping people alive for a moment, but they're really ineffective at ending homelessness. So I think that they have gotten a pretty Seattle, and also I think that some of the other outlying cities have certainly gotten more responsive earlier. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a little bit of a bright spot from the public health point of view here, in that we didn't see any deaths, or haven't heard any, at least, from carbon monoxide or from kerosene heater or curtains catching fire, any of the deaths that at one point were too common. I remember years ago, the Seattle Times was running every day on its front page for a little bit warnings in 13 different languages. And the public health department has put out posters and put out information on, how to avoid carbon monoxide poisoning and, not to have heaters going when there's no air circulation. And it looks like it worked. And, when public health works, nobody notices because nobody's dying. But I think it is worthy of note that, there was an intervention that was started years and years ago that seems to really be effective.
In terms of the deaths, I assume that most of these deaths are homeless people. I think it's probably a fair assumption. My colleague, Danny Westney, wrote a column recently about the number of homeless deaths overall. And the trend is just astonishing. He had a figure in his column that the number of deaths for people living outside had tripled since the declaration of the emergency state of emergency on homelessness in the city, and was up by a third just year over year, last year to this year. It's just a reminder what an astonishing problem we have. And I kind of feel like when I saw the number 5 of people who died outside, I thought that actually seems kind of small to me, given the scope of the problem and kind of how desensitized I think we're getting to the consequences of one of the worst homelessness problems in the country.
Years ago, I did some stories out of Minneapolis where it's very cold all winter long, always. And they had, I think that year, maybe 24 or more than 24 people who died. And some had been turned away from shelters and had gone, into the next snowbank. And what they had figured out was that because people were showing up at shelters drunk or stoned or, in some sort of state, they were being turned away and they had nowhere to go. So they opened a couple of wet shelters, shelters where you're allowed to drink as long as you're not being obstreperous. They took a lot of people in, and change some of the numbers. Do we have wet shelters here? I don't even know. We do.
Yeah, and the emergency shelters that were open this week even allowed pets, which I thought was a
Oh, they did.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. You
That's
know,
great.
one very sad thing I think about that interview clip that we heard at the start of this segment was that it was taped, I believe, very close to where one of the people died, sleeping in their car.
In Ballard, yeah.
That's right.
Mhm.
Very close to the Ballard Public Library. Is that,
Mhm.
am I
think
remembering
so.
that correctly? And this KUOW had a fantastic profile obituary of this man who died, and it's just it's really sad to hear about this poor man sleeping in his car with his dog.
Catherine, you were just telling us that you were in Portland this week, which made me think of that. I think it was ice that brought down a tree limb. Apparently, a couple were getting into an SUV and they put their baby in first, this 9-month-old baby. Tree branch comes down, knocks a power line down onto the car, live wire. A witness also said there was what this witness called a tiny fire underneath or near the car. The man pulled the baby out, and as he was walking up this icy driveway, he slipped, fell, slid back down into the power line, which electrocuted and killed him. The mother went to rescue the child. She slipped and slid into the power line and died. A teenager nearby tried to rescue the baby. He slipped and slid into the power line and died. And another teenager named Mejia Washington, who had witnessed all of this, she saw the baby move his head and she went after him too. And in doing so, she touched the electrocuted man. So there was some conversation about, wow, it's kind of amazing that she didn't get electrocuted. But she managed to save this child who was in good condition. Was all of Portland? I would
was
assume
all over the news
yeah,
in Portland.
yeah.
Oh my gosh, yes. Everybody was talking
Unbelievable.
about this unbelievable tragedy for this family and bravery from Mejia Washington to do this. You know, one thing I had not known before this is public health agencies were telling folks after this this horrific incident that if there's a power line that goes down in your car, you should stay in your car because the rubber tires will protect you. I had no idea.
Yeah, it's an insulation against, so there's not a circuit that lets the electricity flow.
That's right.
But especially if, I mean, first of all, just the shock, but especially if you see a fire or we're sort of conditioned fire near car, you know, there's just so many reasons to understandably to want to get that child out of this car.
Yeah, yeah.
In Seattle, somebody, you know, nothing on the scale of what happened there in Portland, but I saw somebody set a fire in an alley in Pioneer Square by an art gallery. Did you see this? Apparently for warmth, and the fire spread into the building and damaged more than 100 artworks, including Picassos and Rembrandts. And the firefighters couldn't just spray water everywhere; they would have damaged even more. But this is just kind of the, you know, there's the issues that we were talking about, fatal, dangerous cold. Then you just have the school closures and delays, the pipes bursting. I saw Charles Burdette in The Stranger linking that to the failures of capitalism, you know, our sort of infrastructure, pipes bursting, people falling, mountain passes, you know, hazardous and closed, commutes tough, which made it a good time to take light rail.
Except not
because of their fixing some damaged rails. And I actually enjoy transit, and I am driving this week. I'm going nowhere near, and it's going to go on for like a couple more weeks or something. So, and as you said, as you put it, Catherine, we got some new phraseology, cold weather phrases in our vocabulary this week.
Yes, that's right. I learned this week about frost heaving and forbidden popsicles.
Now, wait a minute. Wait. Do people not know? You know, I grew up on the East Coast. Do people here really not know about frost heaves?
I mean, I'd never heard of it.
I've never heard that term.
Never went driving in Vermont. Never went. Wow. It's you know, it's the joke in Minnesota. You know, they have 2 seasons, winter and road repair, and that road repair is mostly from the frost heaves.
Well, Joanne, do you want to tell us what frost heaving is?
Yeah, it's where the ground freezes up and pushes, if there's something solid on top, you know, the ground expands with the freezing and it'll push whatever it is up and around. It'll break roads into, you know, bits that need to be paved over.
Now, I haven't heard of this happening with our roads around here, but Seattle Times published some really cool photos of it happening at turf-covered playfields
Those are beautiful.
around the Seattle area.
And said, why are they doing this? People don't know. But then I thought, well, these photos are so pretty.
They're
The
so
way the
pretty.
frost heaves came up right under the field lines, the white
They
field
looked
lines.
like a giant's rumpled bedclothes to
Oh,
me.
it's
It was so
beautiful.
it was so lovely.
Are they
And
just
then
going to settle again, or is this going to be a huge hit to the Parks Department having to?
well, that's what the Seattle Times reported, is that they're all going to be fine.
Oh, really?
They're just going to go away. They might have gone away already. Who knows? We should go look at some parks.
Wow. I figured frost heave was when you're shoveling the frost off your sidewalk and then you heave it over your shoulder, or people heaving books by Robert Frost, offensive poetry out of our public libraries.
Or maybe people wheezing and heaving after they've shoveled their driveway.
Frost heave, yeah, good point. Good point.
And then the forbidden popsicles.
No.
Washington's Department of Natural Resources published this beautiful and very funny photo of these baby trees. They're covered in these bubbles of ice, and it looks almost magical. But apparently, this is something they do for baby trees when there's a big freeze forecast. They spray them with layers of water to create a protective ice shell around them. They look like large pieces of candy, these trees with the sun hitting them, and they're so close to the ground. But DNR tells us forbidden popsicles, do not eat. Stay away from those baby trees.
But see, now again, that's something you learn back east, that, metal pipes or handrails, you don't put your tongue on them.
I knew that, but I might have tried to put my tongue on a baby tree. I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. It wouldn't stick the way it would stick
Right.
to metal, but still.
All right. I guess that's enough cold talk for now. I hope people are as safe as possible. By the way, consider the avalanche danger as things start to heat, back up. It could be a little rough. I do, since we're talking about the weather, and we began this talking about people dying outside. This all puts a fine point on the risks that people face when they live outdoors, and the new Seattle City Council that voters have installed seems more open to clearing away homeless encampments, which, Jonathan, is controversial. And in fact, the Seattle Times interviewed two people who are well-known advocates for unsheltered folks, and they disagreed about whether clearing encampments is a good idea.
That was interesting.
Yeah, it was a fascinating conversation. One of those advocates is named Tim Harris, who was the founder of Real Change magazine, or street newspaper.
Yeah.
And he was, I got to know Tim when he was on the board of Project Homeless, which I ran for the Seattle Times for a while. Tim's journey on sweeps, I think he acknowledged he's had been a journey on this, was from being more of a classic anti-sweeps advocate.
And I just want to, when we're talking about, sometimes that word itself can be controversial.
Actually, let me come back to that.
Okay.
I was just going to, into now, actually, he was arguing with or debating with Tiffany McCoy, who is one of the employees of Real Change, about that there should be.
I think she was at the advocacy director at Real Change, and now she's at a nonprofit that is advocating for affordable housing.
And Tim said, one of the quote, I pulled a quote here. He said, when we deny that there are impacts in the community from tent camps, advocates advocates look like we're naive. It is so profoundly self-defeating to deny the impact that homeless encampments have on the community, or say these communities should just absorb the impacts because homeless people have it worse. Tim came at this from a small business perspective. I do think, as I mentioned, I was the editor of the Seattle Times homeless team for a while, and we actually, I really wanted to avoid the term sweeps. It's a very loaded term, and I think that what Tim is reflecting there is that there are consequences for both sweeping, removing tent encampments, and not removing tent encampments.
Right.
And as a compassionate community, we have tended towards the not removing tent encampments, certainly as much as other places in the country have. But I think that is shifting. I think that I mentioned before, the Danny Westney column about basically compassion fatigue, where we kind of get inured to the incredible volume of homeless people that have died living outside. I think that the more you see tent encampments, the less empathetic we get. And I think that I think Tim's evolution here is an interesting one because I think it's a little bit of a microcosm of the city as a whole.
But surprising to me, just really surprising that he said that.
Well, what's interesting to me is that both of the advocates who spoke in this article recognized that encampment removals are futile.
Right.
And I think
very
that,
few people go into shelter who are
right, exactly. I think it's 16% was what the report at Great King cited in the article. And Tim Harris's point was, if you have a futile solution that's sharing the burden, it kind of works. But if you have a futile solution that's actively doing harm to vulnerable people, that's a problem. So
and the vulnerable people here being the business,
vulnerable people here being the homeless people. So his argument was that we all know that removing homeless encampments is futile from the standpoint of getting folks into more permanent shelter. But if businesses are suffering along the way, if the burden of these encampments is not being shared, that's not a great solution for
by burden
anyone.
sharing. I just want to make it clear. He's talking about, maybe it's futile because the knock is, well, they're just going to go down the street. And he's saying, they're going to go down the street away from the business that's been dealing with this particular encampment. So moving it around in a futile way, futile way it helps somebody.
But it helps somebody, but it hurts somebody else by that measurement.
And Tiffany McCoy's response to that was, that is dehumanizing. That is, accepting, treating homeless people as if we can just warehouse them in different parts of the city, as opposed to recognizing that every time we remove these encampments, it is deeply disruptive to their lives and does worse. It's possibly worse than futile.
And it treats it like it's that individual camper's fault instead of the system's fault.
One of the things that I got to know, and being the editor of the team, is not all camps are created equal. And Tim actually references this, that the longer a tent camp is in place, the more likely that it's going to be basically taken over by drugs. And I don't know if that's true or not. I trust Tim would know. But it was interesting to see some tent camps were very well self-regulated. You would see that there's actually some camps are very clean, orderly. And then there's other ones that just look like chaos. And I came to realize, like, the ones that look like chaos probably have a lot of drugs in them, and also probably a lot of sex trafficking. So I think it's a nuance. We need to have a nuanced conversation about what removal looks like. That yes, it is doing harm to people, moving them from one place to another. However, there can also be a harm being done to people by having a tent camp remain in place and not having a intervention. So that goes to a poor strategy or resource deployment for the homelessness community if there isn't a better alternative than the camp as well.
Well, intervention, I think, was a really interesting word that you just used, because homeless camp removal is one type of intervention, but we can imagine numerous types of interventions that maybe, we're starting to talk about a little bit more, right? With these new types of teams that are being set up and just starting to work at engaging with homeless folks. But interventions that maybe address some of the problems that Jonathan, you just raised, and Tim also raised about drugs and sex trafficking. Maybe that doesn't involve removal. Maybe that involves something else.
But it's Tim's idea, to move it down the street, because what's he thinking about the people down the street? People who live down the street.
He's saying that if that's assuming, he's assuming the premise that it's futile, people will just move 4 blocks down and 4 blocks down. He's saying that's a kind of burden sharing because it's moving encampments around instead of, why am I, the small business, stuck with the whatever's happening at this possibly drug infiltrated camp, right? That's his argument.
And then the idea is that the encampment might move, to a couple of blocks away, and then again to a couple of blocks away, so that over the course of a year, businesses they'll all get hit, but not constantly.
Well, Portland is having this argument as well right now because it's establishing some sites for permanent encampments. And obviously the siting decisions for that are very contentious.
I think it's a really interesting policy decision, because when we were talking about tiny house villages, quite a while ago, and now there's a lot of tiny house villages. One of the arguments was we're basically changing the definition of habitable conditions to sheds.
Right.
And it's basically the new affordable housing is a shed.
Right.
And it feels like the permanent encampments is actually certainly a step below that. So there is like kind of a slippery slope towards the bottom.
Certainly. Right. And the folks interviewed for this piece also recognize that, right? Like another type of intervention that was imagined was maybe we have a encampment removal, but we don't throw away people's tents. We allow them to be able to set up a shelter for themselves more easily going forward.
Access their stuff.
And
store their stuff.
Exactly. That's exactly what you were saying, Jonathan. It's, the new most affordable housing is a tent.
Yeah.
Okay. This is a great discussion that we will continue to have as we will in the city. We have this new city council who that presumably has a different attitude, a more classically conservative, so to speak, attitude towards some of these issues. That city council is adding another member. They have a vacancy. So a little bit later in the show, we're going to see how that is proceeding and who might be the new city council member, because, it's only, 9 people on the council? It's an important decision. We're going to take a break first and come back with more of what happened this week on Week in Review.
Support for KUOW comes from Lasher, Holdsapple, Sperry, and Eberson, celebrating 50 years of personalized client services, guiding the decisions of individuals and privately held companies. Information at lasher.com. Lasher, Holdsapple, Sperry, and Eberson. We make law make sense.
A public radio station requires many key players to reach its listeners. The most important of them all is you. Listener support is what makes KUOW possible. So thank you for being part of this public service, and thank you for your support to sustain KUOW and NPR for everyone in the Pacific Northwest.
Hi there, I'm Kim Malcolm, inviting you to join me for a refreshing break from the mundane on All Things Considered. You'll hear in-depth local and national reporting, plus a creative dollop of culture, arts, science, music, and more. Listen weekdays starting at 3 at KUOW or stream live on KUOW.org.
This is KUOW's Week in Review. We're right in the middle of it here. I'm your host, Bill Radke, and I've got the Seattle Times' Jonathan Martin and health journalist Joanne Silberner and Insider's Katherine Long. And we're discussing the news of the week. We're live streaming the show on YouTube. And our next topic is, I presume you remember that 3 Tacoma police officers were acquitted last month of murdering Manuel Ellis during an arrest 4 years ago. Ellis was a 33-year-old black man who died after telling officers at least 5 times that he couldn't breathe. The medical examiner ruled his death a homicide caused by oxygen deprivation from physical restraint, but the officers' lawyers said that Ellis died from the methamphetamine in his system and an enlarged heart, and that the officers' actions were justified because Ellis fought them with, quote, extraordinary strength. This week, Tacoma Police Department announced that an internal investigation found that the 3 officers did not violate the department's use of force policy, and all 3 officers will voluntarily leave Tacoma Police, and the department will pay them $500,000 each, in addition to the paid leave they've been receiving since Ellis's death. This did not go over well with Ellis's sister, Monet Carter Mixon, who addressed a city council meeting hours after the agreement was announced.
It's a shame that you guys felt it was okay to pay millions of dollars to Killer's cop, plus almost 4 years worth of salary.
The Tacoma Police Union said, quote, the conclusion is resounding and consistent, exonerated, unfounded, and not guilty, end of quote. Jonathan, you've been following this, and along with your staff, what's your reaction?
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of editing Patrick Malone's coverage. He's now written about this case for 3 years. I got to admit, Patrick and I talked about this, and we didn't think this story was going to be quite as controversial as it did. I think maybe we were a little inured to the all of the developments of this case, but the cops had indicated, officers' attorneys had indicated after their acquittal. By exoneration, by the way, is different than acquittal.
Yeah.
Acquittal at the trial, that they probably weren't going to come back. But basically, they were cleared because the Tacoma Police Department policies were so silent about the tactics that were used to subdue Manuel Ellis, and ultimately that led to his death, including chokeholds and the use of a hobble strap, which is basically would look like a hog tie. And the police chief in clearing these officers, by the way, they did, the one thing that they did cite one of the officers for was the officers violated the policy on courtesy to the public by telling Manuel Ellis to shut the blank up as he was saying he couldn't breathe.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a
They
strange.
didn't say please.
Yeah, yes.
Yes, terribly ironic.
So I feel like I'm talking too much this show, by the way. This story to me is a tidy summary of the divides that have been widened by this trial. The police chief issued a very, I thought, heartfelt apology for what he said was the oppression, abuse, and dehumanization, all carried out under the color of law of people of color, acknowledging basically historically biased policing. The police union calls this a reckless witch hunt, used the word exoneration, and one of the officer's attorneys said basically he had to leave because the city couldn't assure his safety while on the job. So anyway, this case continues to go forward. There still is a civil trial that's going to be happening where the family has sued Tacoma Police. And there's also a DOJ investigation that is underway of the state case.
Well, who had to leave? You said someone had to leave?
Well, Timothy Rankin, one of the
officers. Right.
Yeah.
Think about the police chief doing this and reading his statement, and he said basically it was policy at the time. That's what guided my decisions. But even if it was policy, what a bind he must have been in. And how do the Tacoma taxpayers feel about this? They're giving $1.5 million to the three to go away.
And by the way, plus their accrued vacation, sick time, pensions. So
Yeah.
it's the actual cash value is more than.
And I don't know whether I should bring this up. My husband said, "No, don't bring that up." The
Well, now we
chief
have
of
to.
police,
Exactly.
but the chief of police is black himself, and I don't know him. I haven't followed him. What might be going on in his head to be doing this in this way?
The mayor's also black, by the way.
Right.
Well, speaking of divides that have been deepened by this case, predictably to me, after this case ended as well as it could have for these three officers, right?
Yeah.
Two other officers from the Tacoma Police Department talked to Jason Rantz and say that
This is a very conservative
radio host. They say that the police chief's statement acknowledging these historical wrongs and trying to apologize for them would lead to the extinction of the police force. Not these officers' actions, not the trust that was broken with the community over this case, but the chief's attempt to apologize was what is going to bring the Tacoma Police Department down.
Well, the police chief talked about atrocities, acts of oppression, abuse, and dehumanization. I recognize the atrocities spanning the last 30 years up to the present. And I think these other officers were saying a jury has acquitted these officers. The police chief is announcing that an internal investigation found they did their jobs according to the policy. And is he now accusing them of committing a racially motivated atrocity that they weren't even, I don't know whether they were even legally accused of anything having to do with race, much less convicted. Wasn't that their?
That's not how I read the statement, but
Okay.
yeah, that is certainly how they took it.
Okay.
I don't know if that's how other people read the
I
statement.
actually found it useful to have the unspoken spoken. I think that this is one of the feelings of police officers. Certainly some. I don't want to overgeneralize. I don't think we should overgeneralize. Some, I think, in law enforcement feel persecuted right now. I think that the legacy of the tale of the defund movement, I think, really resonates still with some folks in law enforcement. And so I think this kind of feeds into the reactions after the acquittal and now the clearing. I think that I think they feel like they won this fight, and the jury cleared them, the police chief cleared them, and so they should walk away as wrongfully accused.
So policy is now changed on chokeholds and whatever you called that hobble?
Yeah, I know you asked me. I believe so. I think that I know there was a number of policies that changed when these gaps in TPD policy were identified as part of this case. I think the hobble strap and the chokeholds. Actually, I think chokeholds are banned statewide, if I recall. I think that was state legislation after the racial protests.
Mm-hmm. And a couple of other things. The Tacoma City Council, the same day this week, approved a new police union contract. And a couple of the changes, the department is now required to suspend officers charged with serious crimes without pay. And the internal investigation doesn't have to wait until the criminal prosecution is over. That I'm not sure about. Is that a suggestion that the jury acquittal had something to do with the internal clearing? I don't know, but that's now you can just start the investigation and not wait for the criminal proceeding to conclude.
Well, Tacoma chose to do several things that were more beneficial to the officers, including not starting the investigation, the internal affairs investigation. Other cities have fired people. I think Derek Chauvin was fired before he even went to trial.
But are you saying waiting for the jury acquittal allowed them to keep their jobs, or how did it help the officers to wait?
Yeah, if the internal affairs, say that internal affairs investigation come back and said they all violated policy and they could be fired.
Right.
If that had happened in 2020 when the incident happened, then they wouldn't have been able to keep their jobs and the pay while they're waiting 3 years for trial.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
Anyway, Tacoma did make choices here. And I think that's one of the things I'm not a resident of Tacoma, but maybe talking to your elected leaders about why they chose to do things. And remember, they would need to do things differently in the future. But other cities in similar circumstances have taken made different choices than Tacoma did.
One more question was one that you asked, Catherine, was what for these officers?
One thing my colleagues and I did last year was we examined what happened to 70 police officers who were involved in high-profile killings of civilians. And we found that many of them tried to get jobs working as police officers elsewhere. Some of them were able to, some of them encountered community pressure that made it difficult for them to retain those jobs once their hiring had been discovered.
Yeah. And the Seattle Times pointed out the history of investigations into some of these officers. I never know what information is available to a police department or what they even consider regarding somebody's record.
Right.
Okay. Since we're talking about policing, before we take a break, I want to tell listeners about this proposed law in Olympia at the state legislature, where they're considering barring law enforcement from using deceptive tactics in interrogations. If an officer intentionally lies to a suspect about evidence they have, or about how a confession could make the law be more lenient on them, then any statement the suspect gives could be inadmissible. And Catherine, would that be a first in the nation?
That would be a first in the nation. There are a few states that prohibit police from lying to minors during interrogations, but none that I'm aware of prohibit them from lying writ large. And this is also a little bit different from the rule change that Seattle just passed that barred police from using ruses, except in some very specific circumstances. So that is separate. Those ruses that the Seattle Police Department was talking about were related to things like, for instance, pretending that there is a group of white supremacists coming to to the occupied zone in Capitol Hill in 2020 that had pretty disastrous consequences. But one thing that I was struck by in reading the coverage of this proposed legislation is just how often police do lie during interrogations. I was reading an article in Crosscut, I believe, that cited evidence showing that police lie during interrogations about 30% of the time, which
30% of the investigations.
Right. In 30% of the investigations. Yeah. 30% of the interrogations, police lie. And conversely, when we look at folks who have been exonerated using DNA evidence, about 30% of those folks were originally convicted because police lied or misled them during questioning.
Yeah, but if there are listeners out there who are surprised by all this, I'm with you. I somehow thought that maybe in the Miranda rights or somewhere in there was something that prevented police from lying routinely. But no, there's nothing to prevent that. I did not know that.
If this had been law in the 1970s when I was a kid, it would have eliminated most TV cop shows where, because they would say, "We know you did it. We got the proof. Admit it. We'll go easy on you." That's how they talk for some reason in a very, very gravelly voice. Yeah.
The Crosscut article was really, really good on this case, this law. It had included the testimony from a guy named Ted Bradford, who was one of the he's been exonerated after being convicted of rape and serving 10 years. And he said he had this 9-hour interrogation where they lied to him during it. And he said, "I confessed only because I thought I was going to get out. The only way to get out of this, and that the DNA evidence would clear me." Well, it turned out the DNA evidence was inconclusive, and his confession during this interrogation process in which he was lied to ended up convicting him. So I think that the point about the consequences of the lie, I know police say it's useful and can lead to convictions, but
in fact, I just want to underline what you just said. Crosscut quoted a director from the State Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs opposing this proposed law in Olympia, James McMahon, saying, quote, "Sometimes we have to lie to people to get them to tell the truth. That's just an unfortunate reality of law enforcement."
I think in this moment, like where you have this incredible divide, like we were just talking about in Tacoma, is the line really worth the erosion of public trust? At a moment, I think that probably law enforcement could use more public trust.
And we're exporting this. That Crosscut article, which I agree was excellent, referred to something called the Reed technique, which is it's a company that goes out and teaches this process of how to use lies, how to be effective with it. And they've gone to countries like Iraq and to India, and they've taught this technique. So what a thing to export.
And we have a bit of a local celebrity testifying in support of this bill, Amanda Knox, who was wrongfully convicted of the murder of her roommate in Italy. And I actually had not realized that one reason she was convicted was because police claimed in a 53-hour interrogation to have evidence that she had committed the crime. And she said that led her to make false statements.
Right. Like 5 days of being
being barraged with
being
questions.
barraged. That's a good word. Yeah. Okay, so again, we've been discussing a proposed law at the state legislative level banning law enforcement from using these kind of deceptive tactics in interrogations. So we'll follow that and other laws. I think another proposed law will come up here on Week in Review. We're going to take a break and whip through some more stories, tell you what happened this week and what it means. We're going to be right back.
Support for KUOW comes from Raymark Plumbing and Sewer. Raymark offers residential sewer services to Seattle homeowners and specializes in sewer scoping, cleaning, lining, and trenchless repair. 24-hour emergency service available. Learn more at raymarkplumbing.com. And from the Seattle Office of Labor Standards. On January 13th, 2024, most app-based gig workers will have the right to earn paid sick and safe time leave, minimum pay rates, and minimum payment per travel mile. Learn more at seattle.gov/laborstandards/ordinances.
I'm Simon Adler, senior producer at Radiolab. Come join me and KUOW for Radiolab Live. I'll be telling some stories with Radiolab's iconic sound design Thursday, February 15th at Town Hall Seattle. Find out more and get your tickets at kuow.org/events.
Support for KUOW live events comes from Finney Ridge Painting.
You are listening, perhaps watching at YouTube, but you're at least listening to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke with Katherine Long from Insider. freelance health journalist Joanne Silberner, and investigations editor Jonathan Martin, Seattle Times. And as we've told you, a group of voters filed a legal challenge to keep Donald Trump off Washington's March primary ballot. One of those voters, Kitsap County Middle School teacher Frankie Ithaca, told KUOW the challenge was based on Trump's involvement in the January 6th attacks on the U.S. Capitol.
To me, that looks like an insurrection. And our Constitution explicitly bars people who have engaged in an insurrection to run for office.
But this week, a judge disagreed. Thurston County Superior Court Judge Mary Sue Wilson ruled that in our state, it's up to the Secretary of State to set the ballot unless they make a clear mistake, and she found no such mistake.
The court is denying the request of the petitioner electors to take any action that would direct Secretary of State to remove former President Donald J. Trump's name from presidential primary ballots. There was also a request that the court address general election ballots. The court declines to reach that request as the court finds that it is premature and under legal standards, potentially not yet ripe.
Not yet ripe. A listener named Nick wrote in and said, I and millions of other immigrant citizens of the U.S. who've never participated in an insurrection, never been charged with a felony, will never be eligible to be on the ballot for president. Knowing how hard I studied the Constitution to pass the immigration exam, I feel confident that most, if not all, naturalized citizens understand the Constitution better than Trump. Perhaps smarter people than me can explain why this is a way to get the best leadership for this country. Opines one listener. What was your reaction?
I'm a little reluctant to say this, but I'm not sure this is good precedent. Like, I don't think that, trying to keep presidential candidates off ballots could easily turn out as a bad precedent. I think let the voters decide.
I actually think the outcome of this was a great precedent in that the judge ruled that these voters did not have a leg to stand on, and that Trump should still be allowed to be on the ballot. I think it's great that voters want to express their disapproval with possible presidential candidates in a variety of ways, and this is one such way. And I think the judge's ruling is.
She only spent like 10 minutes or something on the case. It was very quick.
The issue of ripeness is, I think, a key one for me, right? Because the case about Trump engaging in insurrection is not going to be decided until later this summer at the earliest.
Yeah, and it's going to be a Supreme Court,
right?
It's a Supreme Court case with Colorado and then was it New Hampshire, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So
Colorado and Maine. Yeah,
and I just think in terms of this, it's not just this Washington State case. I think the effort to keep Trump off the ballot, because the insurrection clause is concerning to me.
The U.S. Supreme Court hears arguments next month on this constitutional question. Meanwhile, a Washington state legislator is backing a law to keep Trump off the fall ballot, which may not affect the presidential election outcome, since the Democrat will presumably get all of Washington's electoral vote, but the process matters. Democracy. Also in the Washington legislature, Joanne, a proposal to restrict mobile device use by public school students, and they don't mean scooters.
Right.
When they say mobile device.
They're talking cell phones or smartphones. And I would so like to see that. I would so like to see it restricted. But I think you have to be really careful about it. When you think about it from the kids' point of view, we as a society have said to them, we're not going to do the other protections that we could do. We're not going to, have gun control. We're not going to have ammunition control. We're just going to, that's going to happen. But we're going to take away something that you have that might feel comforting to you, that might be able to protect you or help you in some way. So I think you have to let them hang on to it, but keep it in their pockets. It's obvious if they take it out. And boy, is it harming. I look around at kids, I don't have a kid myself, and I know how hard it is to restrict their use. But I think, if it's a school policy, keep your phone in your pocket.
But from what I hear, it's not really working. Kids are they have it out. It's a big complaint that kids are texting in class.
Sure. It was a big complaint when I was
we passed notes from, in my day,
right.
We passed notes back and forth, and there were rules. You're not allowed to pass notes. And if the teacher saw you, she grabbed the note, or he grabbed the note and read it out loud to the class. And that was awful. Right. It seems to me like it's doable. I think it's doable, and I think it should be done.
What did you say in that note that you wrote as a child?
I'll never tell.
Okay.
I wasn't caught.
So maybe no to telephones in school, but a yes to artificial intelligence in school this week. The state school superintendent, Chris Rakedahl, issued new guidance about how schools can use AI in the classroom.
Artificial intelligence is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's in things that we can't even imagine today. Don't our students deserve the opportunity to learn what is it? What's in there? What are those algorithms doing? How do they impact learning? How do they impact our lives so that our students are on the front end?
Washington's the 5th state in America to issue this kind of guidance. It calls for school leaders to give teachers professional development on how to incorporate AI into their teaching.
I mean, I think having used a large number of AI tools, I think either Superintendent Rakedahl is overselling the benefits of AI or taking a very expansive definition of what AI is. I mean, I agree that AI probably does have a place in the classroom and that teachers and students should be experimenting with it. Still curious to see what that could be in practice in a way that is helpful to students. But it's going to be interesting to me to see whether or not we can actually come up with some of those applications.
A deputy in the state superintendent's office said that a teacher in high school, for example, could have 150 kids, can't provide specific feedback, but that AI can. But you're questioning the quality of that feedback, perhaps?
I am certainly questioning the quality of that feedback.
Okay. Another story this week after Seattle's I-5 protest recently, there's now a bill in the legislature to increase penalties for intentionally blocking highways. The protest against Israel bombardments in Gaza shut down the freeway for 5 hours, backed up traffic for 6 miles. No arrests yet, although those are theoretically still possible. Under this proposed law, people who block traffic on state highways could be charged with a gross misdemeanor instead of just misdemeanor disorderly conduct, which is what protesters now face. And if the highway obstruction creates a risk of injury or slows down an ambulance, or if people ignore an officer's order to disperse, they could be charged with a Class C felony. Yes?
One thing I wanted to point out is that the protesters who shut down the highway have said repeatedly that they had steps in place that would have allowed an ambulance through their protest. I think that
How would they do that?
That's a great question. I'd love to know more about that, but that seems to be something that they had considered and they were sensitive to how their protest could possibly affect emergency care.
In other news this week, Washington's the first state to challenge that supermarket merger, Kroger and Albertsons. The state attorney general says this proposed $25 billion deal would eliminate head-to-head competition between the state's two biggest grocery operators, meaning fewer choices for shoppers. The FTC is still weighing that merger. This week, the Seattle City Council chose 8 finalists to fill a vacant seat. One of them will fill that seat. And KUOW politics reporter David Hyde says the frontrunner appears to be Chinatown International District activist Tanya Wu.
3 city council members have named Wu as their top choice. And over the weekend, a letter leaked from political insider Tim Cease. He urged the business community to back Wu.
Jonathan Publicola reported that Tim Cease, a former deputy mayor, told donors to take advantage of the success they'd had giving money to pro-business candidates. Quote, the independent campaign expenditure success earned you the right to let the council know not to offer the left the consolation prize of this council seat.
Yeah, the boosted volume of a voice with money behind it. Yeah,
I thought we all had the right to let the city council know.
We do, but some of us have more right, apparently.
I see.
Yeah, I think the question here, one of the big questions for the last few years has been the sort of the moving to the center of the Seattle City Council, and I think everyone expects Tanya Wu. Tanya Wu appears to be the kind of the inside track for this, which would bring the council again further towards the center and kind of away from the idealist, a more progressive.
Depending what you call the center, yes.
Yes, right. Yeah, it's always true. Yeah, I like when people call these all Democrats conservative.
Right.
So Seattle conservative is different than
right.
So yeah, I think I suspect that the business community is probably going to be more happy with this council than it was with the previous one.
Right. A couple more things and then a reason to smile. This week's weather's got our mountain snowpack up to about 73% of normal this time of year. We started at a deficit from the drought. And this week, the UW introduced its new head football coach, Jed Fish, who comes here from University of Arizona, replacing Kalen DeBoer, who just left for Alabama, whose departure has resulted in a bunch of players who had committed to the Huskies uncommitting because apparently they'd only made a non-committal commitment. Okay. We didn't talk about Costco yet. Will you tell us, Catherine, what Costco's doing? Scanning your membership card now?
Oh,
share it?
yes. Costco has said that they're going to start scanning your membership card when you walk into the store instead of having an employee do a quick little visual check of it. And if you have ever borrowed your friend's Costco card, you know how easy it is to get into Costco with somebody else's card. However,
Just put your thumb on the photo.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not endorsing that, I
No.
should say. No, not at all. Until recently, though, it's been pretty difficult to actually buy anything at Costco with somebody else's card because the cashiers will check and do a pretty thorough check of it. But in 2019, Costco began rolling out self-checkout. And as we know, the problems with self-checkout are legion. And it has turned out that a lot of folks have been using somebody else's Costco card and checking out at self-checkout. Costco is getting pretty concerned about this. So they're moving away from two positions that they'd previously held. One of them was our cashiers can do it better than self-checkout. They're staking a claim and self-checkout is the way of the future.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one was Costco had previously said that organized retail crime, retail theft, which has been a big panic among retailers, was not something that they were particularly worried about. And I would say that the fact that they're about to make us start queuing up and scanning our cards to get into their stores suggests that maybe they do have some concerns after all.
Speaking of queuing up, speaking of things that take a frustratingly long time, I did a terrible job of clock management. So we are right at the end of the show. I only have time to say I smiled because that listener that we quoted earlier who filed that attempt to block Trump from the primary ballot, Frankie Ithaca got the idea listening to KUOW, an interview where the Secretary of State said nobody's made a challenge and the deadline was near. And this listener thought, well, I'm a registered voter, and whether you share this person's politics or not, I thought that was an example of how local news coverage, which we value on this program, can engage people to take some action.
That's impact right there.
That's impact, baby. Okay, we got to go. We have been talking to, that was Katherine Long there, investigations correspondent at Insider, freelance health journalist Joanne Silberner, Seattle Times investigations editor Jonathan Martin. I just can't get over how much I like seeing you all every single time you come. Thank you.
That hour flew by.
Thanks, Bill.
Flew by. Thank you, producer Kevin Kniestedt, Bernard Willett running the board, and we'll do this again next week.
Support for KUOW comes from Emporium Presents, presenting the Avett Brothers on July 12th at Merrymore Park, part of the